This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
There's the stink of oil about him.
Hello and welcome into Slick Talk. I am your host, Blackstone Joe, and I'm glad you're here. Over the course of this show's history, we've answered many questions about the wide world of oil and what you can learn from oil analysis. But it's certainly true that a few common concerns remain in the field of play for folks both new and familiar to what we do at Blackstone Laboratories. With that in mind, we're going to re-release select episodes that we find are just as relevant today as they were on the initial release date. And when applicable, take some time after the episode to clarify any relevant changes either in our viewpoints on the matter, differences in methodology, and so on. So stay tuned till the end of this episode to hear a breakdown of what's changed. What stayed the same since releasing this episode, however, is the common concern of time and its effect on oil that's either on the shelf or already in the sump. This was a fun episode, looking back, one that has certainly made a mark of its own as our highest played so far. And without further ado, here's No Time to Change. Hello and welcome to episode 105, titled No Time to Change. That title is a not-so-subtle nod to one of my favorite James Bond films, as well as a hint at our thesis for today's episode, that being calendar time and why you should think twice before changing the oil just based on how long it's been on the shelf or in the sump. While this episode is short on espionage, exotic locales, and dry martinis, it does contain more than its fair share of data that will help you make informed choices with how you take care of the engine you own. So let's get into it. Today's episode began not in the studio, but when we were working on a social media project in the garage, that being myself and the producer of this show, as well as senior analyst Josh. So we wanted to take some photos of fresh oil, and the purpose was to create a post that would talk about why it's valuable to test fresh oil, why you might want to take a look at it. And so I grabbed what I found to be the first interesting bottle on the shelf, that being a quart of Mobil 1 040 European car formula. So I grabbed this off the shelf for, no particular reason other than it caught my eye. I figured, hey, why not test this thing, see what it looks like? I have no idea how old it is, at least by taking the bottle at face value. There was a string of letters and numbers on the bottle, but nothing that looked like an easily identifiable, month, year of when exactly this oil was produced. So why not, in the name of science, take a look at a sample of this oil off the shelf? It was about half full. Cap was, secured. So in theory, it would be in good shape. The next step was to test it. But before proceeding to test this oil, we wanted to gain a little more insight about it. Taking that string of letters and numbers I referenced earlier, we consulted with the mobile help desk to find out exactly how old this oil was, and we got an interesting answer. So, a little about this production code, if you have any interest in this yourself. You might find this printed on the back of the oil you bought towards the bottom of the container. Our code specifically was 10110J03R. Now, after consulting with the mobile help desk, we found out that that code translates to a production date of September 3rd, 2010. Oil all the way back from 2010, on the shelf, half full. What do we think it's going to look like? Or better yet, should we even entertain the thought of this being serviceable oil? Now, we can test it, of course, and come up with our own data points, but we are interested in hearing what exactly the mobile help desk would tell us. What would their concerns be? Should we throw this away immediately? Is it toxic waste? What were they going to tell us about the unused oil that we had that was produced all the way back in 2010. And we got some interesting answers, if not a little incomplete or unsatisfying for this pair of intrepid analysts. So first off, after learning the production date, the next step was to ask them a specific question. What are concerns about using an oil past its shelf life? And they responded with, quote, Mobil doesn't recommend using that oil because it's over 13 years old. Motor oil, again, I quote, breaks down over time. When oil does break down, it loses its effectiveness and can no longer properly protect the engine. Well, that seemed a little vague, and we wanted to go beyond a broad stroke statement, so we kept pressing them a little, asking them for more specificity on how exactly the oil is breaking down. What are the physical properties most affected by this quote-unquote breakdown, and would it harm an engine to run this oil? Enter another individual from the Mobil Help Desk team who offered this response, quote, if a product exceeds its shelf life, we wouldn't suggest using the product and would not support that, as the product may have undergone certain changes due to its chemical composition and its environmental conditions. Using such a product may or may not affect your equipment, but we don't support using the product. Now, while these replies did not prevent us from testing the oil, certainly, or labeling it unfit for use, they were interesting as a prelude to our results. We wanted to know if there were any specific things we should be looking for in the physical properties, the spectral results, all the data that we can obtain that would go along with the idea that the oil should not be used simply based on the fact that it is from 2010. And without further ado, we have the results. So when sending this sample through the lab, I wanted to run basically every test I could think of. And I started with the standard analysis, one that a lot of our listeners surely know well at this point. It includes a test that finds the elements that are part of the additive package, metals, as well as a breakdown of the physical properties, viscosity, flash point, whether or not there's any water or solid material, so on. And I'll jump right in with the spectral results. Here we had trace amounts of aluminum, iron, perfectly normal for unused oil from any era. It's going to show up in oil that you bought yesterday, and it's going to show up in oil made all the way back in the 50s. More on that 50s part at the very end of this episode. But what we had here was a little bit of metal, perfectly normal to find in unused oil. We also had an additive package that looks pretty typical for what you'd find today. Elements like molybdenum, phosphorus, zinc, all used for anti-wear purposes. We also have boron, calcium, a pinch of magnesium, detergent dispersant additives, and levels that look pretty typical for oil, again, that could have been made yesterday. Just because the oil came out in 2010 did not mean the additive levels were unusually low. They looked pretty darn typical. Moving into the physical properties, we have a viscosity, perfectly within the expected range for a 040. We have a flash point starting appropriately high, no measurable water content. Again, no water was evident when testing this oil. We also did not find any insolubles. Now, if there's a trace of insolubles in unused oil, that's usually not a problem. It's often just additive that fell out of suspension during our testing. Nothing to worry about, but we didn't find even a trace of insolubles here. And again, no water. And last but not least, we have some added testing, which you can also do if you are sending in a sample of used or unused oil. But this goes beyond the standard analysis. That includes a TBN, which read nice and high at 12. That's even a bit higher than you'll see in a lot of other oils, really. A TBN around 9 or 10 is pretty typical right out of the gate. So 12 stands out as a strong starting TBN, showing a lot of active additive ready for use. Just because the oil had been on the shelf didn't mean that the TBN was lower as a result. Plenty strong. And you have a TAN that read 3.7. Now, a TAN is a measure of how acidic the oil is. You might think that an unused oil is going to have a 0.0 TAN starting out, but as with metals, it's going to have some acidity starting out. That is perfectly normal, and a reading of 3.7 does not strike me as unusual, especially after years of looking at used and unused samples alike. A TAN of 3.7 is pretty standard, doesn't bother me at all, and a starting TBN of 12 is especially good. So what we have here is an oil that was sitting on the shelf. Again, it was about half full because, we probably had a customer drop it off, or maybe we brought it in and left it in the garage for one reason or another, but half full, but sealed up as it should be. And undisturbed for a period of who knows how many years. Maybe someone had gone and used it here or there for sampling purposes, much like we did. But the point is that despite sitting in the garage for over a decade, this oil looked perfectly fine, ready to use. I'd put it in my car right now. So suffice to say that if you have oil in the garage that you're wondering about using, Calendar Time is no reason to rule it out, to treat it as oil that you should avoid. But if you do have any doubts in your mind, an analysis, in my opinion, is all you need to determine whether or not that's good oil. You can rule out moisture, you can look at the viscosity, you can see what the starting TBN is, whether or not the additive package is to your liking, whether it looks typical, say, compared to an oil made recently. I think that would make perfect sense as a concern on a customer's end. If they want to see how the additive package lines up, just as added indication, peace of mind for whatever they're going to do with it, then sure, send in a sample and you can confirm. Again, this is a sample that's 3 ounces, so you're not running through all of your oil just to determine whether or not you should use it, and you'll have useful data points like a starting TBN, valuable information depending on how long you want to use that oil. And you don't have to merely rest on some common misconceptions, that being that oil is just going to break down by sitting. However, I've spent all this time talking about this unused oil, so I think it's only fair to introduce the other side of that coin, oil that's been in the sump. Do we need to treat that differently after it's been, doing the rigors of cleaning and lubricating the engine and then sitting? Is the story different there? Not only do I want to approach this angle because of the fact we're talking about the unused oil to start, but we had a question come in from a listener of the program, Phil, who noted that my claims in the last episode, 104, where I discussed calendar time not being a factor in oil changes, that this was a pretty striking contradiction to, the popular belief, as Phil noted. So I think it's more than worthwhile to dive in here. And Phil specifically asked about what I would say a modern engine is, because if you're listening closely to that episode 104, I mentioned that oil in modern engines, you don't need to change it just based on calendar time. So it's fair to define modern engine. And when we say that, we're mainly talking about anything made 80s and onward, but really it can extend a bit further back than that. But 80s and onward is a safe bet that what you're sampling is an engine that does not have an open breather, something that's going to allow moisture. Because if you don't have an open breather, moisture is not going to accumulate in the used oil unless you have a coolant leak, in which case, of course, moisture is all but assured. So when looking at gas and diesel engine samples dating back to the 80s and onward, we do not anticipate there being a moisture buildup or a breakdown of the additive package, so on and so forth, just based on it sitting. And this applies to oil after it's already been running in that engine for X amount of miles and then sits. Miles are what you need to be keeping track of when you're talking about a gas diesel engine that's out on the road, not how long it's been sitting. But instead of just saying 80s and onward, I figured it would be worthwhile and interesting to many of you to pull examples of oil that has actually been in an engine made from the 80s and every other decade beyond that. But let's start with the more modern models and work backwards. My first example for you, in terms of calendar time not being a factor in the oil breaking down, is a sample from a 2020 F-150 powered by a Ford 3.5-liter EcoBoost. Now, this is oil that had been in place for 6 months. 6 months is a concern for some owners. 3 months is a concern for some owners even. So this was a logical place to start. And here we had an oil that had a viscosity well within range. It had a strong TBN showing active additive remaining, that being a TBN of 3.1. There were some high wear and silicon levels, but this is a low mileage engine, one on probably the second or third oil change, and as such, that metal and silicon content is just a cocktail of lingering wear and sealer material. Nothing looked unusual, and the customer had not changed the oil yet, so we had no problem suggesting another 2,000 miles on that fill. So, 6 months, engine made in 2020, we're good to go. Let's move backwards. Next, we have a sample from a 2017 Wrangler, powered by a 3.6-liter Pentastar engine. Now, this is one instance where the customer was concerned about oil that had been in use for 2 years. So here we have a sample with, again, a TBN that's sufficiently high. It's north of 2. 2 is about the point where active additives are used up. So you want a TBN above 2, especially if you're going to plan on extending your oil change intervals. So we have a TBN that looks good, a viscosity that is within the expected range for Chevron Supreme 530, the oil they were using. And we have wear levels that look good for mileage on the oil. This customer had ran it 5,000 miles and had it in the sump for a total of 2 years. Now, were they interested in running this oil longer had they not changed it before sampling? We would have said absolutely. Because again, despite the oil having 2 years in the sump, no water was detected. Now, it's going to make itself pretty clear when it is present in any significant amount by causing the sample to crackle during the flashpoint test. Did not do that. And of course, if you have exorbitant amounts of water, then you'll see a visible separation, something you don't even need a lab to find out. But no visible separation, no crackle during the flashpoint test, strong TBN. The list goes on as far as the data backing up this particular engine being just fine with that oil being in there for 2 years. Sticking on that 2-year trend, we have a sample from a 2000 F350. This one is a diesel, 7.3 power stroke. Again, oil that had been in use for 2 years. I'll start with the TBN, 5.5, showing plenty of active additive left. Viscosity, well within the expected range for Motorcraft 1540. We have wear levels that look great. Of course, that's no surprise. We're looking at a 7.3 power stroke. These things tend to look fantastic in analysis, so it's no wonder that this one did as well, especially since harmful contamination was not part of the picture. Now we're getting a little more ambitious. A 1997 Town Car, powered by Ford's 4.6-liter V8. This oil had been in use for 5 years. 5 years in an unknown amount of mileage. However, even after 5 years in the sump, the TBN read 2.2, getting fairly low, but it showed some active additive left, no water, of course. And the viscosity, well, it read in the 530 range. The customer didn't know what the oil was going in, but without there being any contamination from fuel that would have thinned the oil down or water that would have thickened it up, odds are good that was a 530 to start. Now, from a wear standpoint, we do have some high metals and silicon. Now, some folks might think that, well, the metal is, of course, from how long the oil was sitting in the sump, but not necessarily. There's a litany of reasons why there could be some extra metal compared to averages, one being if the oil run was longer than the interval our averages are based on. For that particular model, it's a 5,200 mile interval, and it was a recent purchase for the customer. It's entirely possible last owner had that oil in use for a longer interval, or we could be looking at a situation where there was wear in. We wonder about wear in because silicon can show sealer material if it's not from dirt, which leads me to my last point here, which is that the extra metal could also be evidence of there being an air filtration issue, silicon being dirt getting past the air filter. It's important to keep in mind that these elements have more than one explanation, but as far as the oil's physical properties go, nothing concerning about this oil, even after it had been in use 5 years from a physical standpoint. You're not seeing an unusually low TBN, moisture buildup, and irregular viscosity. Some people think that the oil is going to naturally solidify after it's been in use for a long time, but insolubles, which are solids that we measure in the used oil, those were low as well. Also evidence of effective oil filtration, so all good there. Now we're going to spice it up even further with a sample from a 1984 F250. The owner was kind enough to note 6 years of inactivity this truck had experienced. 6 years and, well, a report that looked pretty good. Normal viscosity, no water, low insolubles. They didn't request a TBN, but I have no reason to think it would have been unusually low. Here, though, we did find a high iron level. And just like I talked about in the previous sample from the 97 Town Car, a lot of reasons why that may be. A long oil run. Steel parts could also just be wearing more than they should be. Anytime you have the first sample with an unknown amount of mileage, there's a lot of factors to take into consideration. Heck, if you're talking about a big diesel and you have no idea how long, say, the owner was idling, if they're doing a lot idle time, if they're tracking miles instead of hours, and that can artificially inflate iron higher than we'd expect it to be compared to our averages. Maybe there is simply some extra wear at steel parts, but the oil, again, going to the physical properties, looked just fine. And last, but certainly not least, I had to pull one instance I thought was particularly impressive with regards to how oil can hold up regardless of how long it's been in the sump. And here was the most impressive one we could find amongst all of the report writing and proofing we had to do during the day in preparation for this episode. We have a sample of Mobil 1 1040 that had been in use for 10 years. Specifically in a 95 993, powered by a 3.6 flat 6 air-cooled engine. The oil had 776 miles on it. Not a lot. So even though this oil had been in use for 10 years, it looked great. A TBN of 7.9, which is appropriately high for an oil that doesn't have a lot of mileage on it. The viscosity, almost dead center in that expected range for Mobil 1 1040. An additive package that doesn't really leave anything to be desired. The levels of anti-wear and detergent dispersant additives all look good. And metals in this case, well, they look pretty good too. Although, as I said, 776 miles, we don't really expect a lot of metal in there to begin with, even if, an engine may not have the best wear profile in the world. An oil run that brief isn't a lot of time for metal to accumulate, and as such, we wouldn't anticipate there being a lot of metal. So the low levels in this sample, well, they fit the bill. Now, with so many hot takes thrown out, I feel it's only fitting to include what are some exceptions in terms of the applications we've been talking about. So oil not breaking down based on calendar time. This has been in regards to gas diesel engines, and it's true for gas diesel engines, no matter what you're talking about, if it's on the road. Now, one outlier, one exception to that would be if you are talking about, say, aircraft. Now, that isn't to say the oil is going to necessarily break down on you, but those do have the open breathers I was talking about earlier. They introduce the opportunity for moisture to accumulate in piston aircraft. So again, we've been talking about gas diesel engines and all of those takes apply. However, if you are an aircraft owner and you're pondering whether or not you can confidently keep oil in use for years and years, well, you do want to look out for moisture there. Breakdown of additives, viscosity, etc., not as much of a concern. The viscosity is probably going to be fine, but moisture buildup can be a possibility in that arena. Some marine engines, but when it's a gas diesel engine and you're deciding when to change that oil, well, it's no time to change. The miles might tell you something different, though. You do want to rest on mileage, as that is when the oil is doing its job of cleaning and lubricating the engine, the very processes that result in metal buildup and accumulation of a contaminant. Say if your engine does have like a coolant leak or an air filtration issue, then of course all of that time can result in contamination accumulating and causing the oil to not do its job. But for an engine that is merely going about its business and then sitting for a period of time, well, that's okay. But of course, you don't have to take my word for it. You can send in a sample of the used or unused oil and go right to the data. Look at your TBN, look at your viscosity, go to the spectral results, see if there's contaminants or metals. And using those data points, it's my contention that you don't need to worry about dumping that oil, especially if it looks just fine from a physical standpoint. The only one that really you need to keep in mind. Contrary to popular belief, oil can hold up pretty darn well. But of course, the laboratory located at 416 East Pettit Avenue in Fort Wayne, Indiana would be happy to tell you all you need to know about it. In closing, I do want to reference back earlier in this episode, amongst all the hot takes, I did reference oil made in the 1950s that we've looked at. We have a series of newsletters, which if you haven't checked these out, I encourage you to do so. These were published on the website back in 2012, 2013, and they center around a batch of eBay oils that Ryan Stark, president of Blackstone, purchased out of curiosity and then for function, because he bought several oils off of eBay, tested them to see what they looked like, and now, contrary to the Mobile 1040 I was breaking down earlier, the additive packages were quite a bit different back then. Very interesting to look at, but despite additive packages that did not line up with today's expectations or standards, the oil was nevertheless put into use in his Chevy. And I will tell you that that engine is still around, still doing well. So this eBay oil experiment is one that I would encourage you to look at if you ever want to see an example of a mix of oils. You know, some people still don't want to put more than one brand together because of concerns. If you want to see a mix of oils and how they perform, and if you want to see very odd oils in terms of, you know, the additive packages were so different back then, as well as viscosity ranges that were far different. Well, the data is all there for you, and you can see how the used oil samples looked with those eBay oils in service. Again, you know, they date back to the 40s, 50s, collector's items really, but they not only looked interesting, they also performed. Again, the engine's still out there, and you would think that if that was such a concern, there would be heavy damage to show for it, but contrary, that engine's getting along well. So I want to thank Phil for reaching out with more questions on the previous episode's topic. Sometimes I need reminders that despite recording so many of these episodes, a lot of you are going to be hearing these takes at different times, and 105 episodes in, it's going to be easy to forget or need a refresh on certain ideas that are so common for me to say in a report or throw out to listeners that, it's good to have a reminder that, folks outside this building aren't hearing these takes at the same furious rate that we give them, and they aren't seeing the data as often as we are. So appreciate Phil reaching out, because it was fun to revisit this, and it was fun to look at these samples to see all of the data that backs up these beliefs we have, regardless of time. That's not the time to change, but the miles they need to be keeping in mind. So now I'm sure you're wondering what might have changed since we dropped No Time to Change. Fortunately, the answer is not much. When it comes to oil, you still need to focus on actual use. Sitting on the shelf or in a sump doesn't result in oil breaking down or losing its ability to clean and lubricate a system. We did spend a fair amount of time on the TBN in this episode, though, and there isn't as much of an emphasis on that particular result on our end nowadays. If you've ordered a kit recently, you'll notice we don't ask if you want a TBN on the slip, though we still run this test quite often. It's just as viable as it was before, and on that note, you can always request a TBN. It's not going anywhere, but for us, we ran into a lot of situations where it wasn't terribly applicable. Samples with fewer than 2,000 miles on them, for example, will come in, and those are almost guaranteed to have a good TBN because low miles don't lend much time for the additive package to break down. And more importantly, a strong TBN can often create a false sense of security. Even if a TBN is strong, you still want to check for and address issues such as poor wear or harmful contamination, because a strong TBN alone may mean that a longer run is doable, but that's only one piece of the pie. The rest of our findings also play a major role. A low TBN remains notable, so if you have a low TBN, that would be worth considering, especially if you wanted to run longer. But you can still rely on a standard analysis to tell you if the viscosity is good, where metals stand, presence of contamination or lack thereof, and all of that matters when it comes to evaluating your engine and whether it should go longer between oil changes. For a thorough breakdown on the latest when it comes to all things TBN, just check out our recent episode with Ryan Stark, president of Blackstone Laboratories, episode 138. That brings this re-release to a close. Thanks for hanging with me. This is Blackstone Joe signing off.
The Slick Talk podcast is powered by Blackstone Laboratories. If you're ready to start your oil analysis journey, visit blackstone-labs.com to order your free test kit.